what happens when the quiet kid finally stands up? One classroom, one challenge, and a piano performance that shatters every expectation. Watch Jason prove them all wrong. At Jefferson High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, Jason Rivers had grown all too accustomed to the sting of being overlooked. At just 16, he was a quiet, thoughtful student. Nothing like the troublemakers who made their way through the halls, or the class clowns who drew attention without effort. Jason wasn't the kind of person who sought the spotlight. He preferred to blend in, focusing on his studies, always turning his homework on time, and excelling at everything he did. But no matter how much he accomplished, no matter how much he raised his hand in class, his teachers seemed to look right past him. It wasn't that he was invisible in the traditional sense. No, Jason's presence was always acknowledged, but never in a way that truly mattered. It wasn't a mere oversight. It was a feeling of being unimportant, as though no matter what he said or did, the teachers simply didn't see him as worthy of their attention. When he knew the answer to a question, his hand would shoot up, fingers aching with eagerness, but his teacher would glance over him, usually settling on one of the other students, often the ones whose parents had connections or who fit some unspoken ideal. If he waited longer, hoping for a second chance, it never came. They pretended not to notice. And so, Jason learned to stay quiet. His teachers didn't hate him. No, it wasn't hatred that Jason felt. It was indifference. They ignored him because they didn't expect him to succeed, didn't expect him to be anything more than just another face in the crowd. It wasn't cruel, but it was a different kind of harm, a harm that settled in the pit of his stomach, making him doubt himself every day, a harm that whispered, louder than any words, that maybe he wasn't good enough, maybe he'd never be good enough. Jason had long since come to terms with the quiet injustice that surrounded him. At Jefferson High School, history and social studies were supposed to be subjects that brought excitement, a chance to explore the past and understand the world. But for Jason, those classes were more about enduring the way his teachers barely acknowledged his efforts. Mrs. Monroe, the history teacher, was one of the worst offenders. She had a habit of asking questions, often about famous historical figures. Figures she seemed only willing to celebrate if their names fit the mold of the right student. When it was time to talk about the American Revolution or the Civil War, her eyes would light up as she called on the white students, the ones whose names she could pronounce without hesitation. Their answers were always greeted with praise, a smile, a nod. But Jason, his answers went unnoticed, as if the words were invisible, like they were never even said. He raised his hand in earnest, his heart pounding with the hope that this time might be different. But it never was. She would glance at him, almost with an air of disinterest, before turning to someone else, usually a student who fit the mold of her ideal learner. And it wasn't just in history. In art, when Jason offered thoughts on black artists or the significant contributions of African Americans in shaping culture, Mrs. Monroe would quickly move the conversation along. The same happened in literature. Every time he tried to bring something important to the table, it was quickly brushed aside, as if his voice didn't belong in the discussion. It wasn't that he wasn't heard, it was that he wasn't seen, not as an individual with thoughts and opinions worthy of exploration. No, to them, he was just another face in the crowd, a student with potential, yes, but one they hadn't yet bothered to truly understand. And each time it happened, the hurt built quietly but steadily. Jason didn't let it show, but deep inside, the pain gnawed at him, feeding the feeling of invisibility that seemed to follow him everywhere. Jason had never been one to rock the boat. He'd learned early on that the more you made noise, the more reasons people would find to dislike you. His mother, always calm and pragmatic, had taught him that the quiet way was the safest way. Keep your head down, do your work, and stay out of trouble, she'd always said. And so Jason did. He never challenged his teachers, never stood up to the unfairness that clung to him like a shadow. He didn't want to cause problems. His mother had also told him that people would only notice him when they had a reason to, and Jason wasn't sure he wanted that kind of attention. So he kept to himself, working hard in the background, always turning in assignments on time and acing tests. But it didn't matter. He could have been the best student in the entire school, and still, it wouldn't change how he was treated. What really bothered him, though, wasn't the favoritism, the clear bias that hung in the air like a fog. It was a quiet expectation, no, the certainty that he would fail. Jason could feel in the looks that his teachers gave him when they thought he wasn't looking, the heavy silence that settled over the room when he made a mistake. They weren't just waiting for him to slip up, they were practically counting on it, as if his failure would somehow validate their belief that he wasn't good enough, that he was just another kid who didn't belong. And Jason knew it. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a gut-deep certainty. Every time his hand shot up in class, he could see the way his teacher's eyes barely skimmed over him before landing on someone else. Every time his voice cracked with nervousness, he felt the silent judgment weighing down on him. He wasn't even given a chance to be anything other than the kid who never quite fit in. And as much as he hated it, Jason couldn't escape the crushing reality of it all. One morning, something unexpected happened. Jason sat quietly at his desk in history class, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his notebook as he went over his notes one last time before the bell rang. It was just another day, like any other, filled with the usual routine. The teacher would drone on, students would quietly ignore him, and Jason would quietly take notes, hoping to make it through without drawing attention. He liked it that way. He was used to being invisible. But that day, Mrs. Monroe suddenly turned toward him. "Jason, why don't you try answering this one?" she asked, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the classroom. Jason froze. For a moment, it was as if the world had paused. The other students turned to look at him, some with raised eyebrows, others with an almost childlike curiosity. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been called on in months, maybe even years. He glanced around the room, expecting to see someone else's hand raised higher, ready to be noticed, but there was no one. His hand wasn't even up, yet here she was, asking him. He swallowed, trying to mask the nervous knot that had suddenly appeared in his stomach. The question was about the Gettysburg Address. Jason had studied it in detail. He knew the answer. He just had to say it, but the pressure felt unbearable. His fingers tingled, the thought of being wrong flashing through his mind. He quickly glanced up at the board, confirming the question. He didn't need to think for long. It was a speech given by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 to honor the soldiers who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg. Jason said, his voice steady but quieter than he intended. He spoke about the importance of equality and preserving the Union. The room was eerily silent. Jason's answer was perfect, without hesitation, without flaw. But instead of the usual nods of approval or a simple good job, Mrs. Monroe simply raised an eyebrow. "HM, not bad." Her tone was flat, dismissive even. Jason knew that look. She wasn't impressed, but she wasn't about to let anyone see her disappointment. Not yet. The rest of the class seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm after Jason answered the question, but the tension in the air didn't quite dissipate. Mrs. Monroe, with her stern expression, flipped through the gray book, her eyes scanning each page with an air of deliberate slowness. Jason felt his heart thumping in his chest, a strange sense of unease creeping up his spine. He had given the right answer, but that didn't seem to matter. He had known the answer, and yet there was something about the way Mrs. Monroe was looking at him that made him feel exposed. Then, in a move that made every student in the room sit up a little straighter, Mrs. Monroe cleared her throat and turned to Jason again. "Jason, tomorrow we'll be having a special performance in class," she said, her voice oddly casual. "I heard your grandfather was quite the piano player. Why don't you play something for us?" The classroom was suddenly alive with whispers. Tyler, the only friend Jason had, looked at him with wide eyes, his brow furrowing in silent disbelief. Jason froze, the words hanging in the air, tasting like metal in his mouth. He didn't play piano in front of anyone. Not like this. "Tomorrow you'll perform for us, right?" Mrs. Monroe pressed, her voice sweet but with an edge. It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. Jason stood there, heart racing, and for a split second, he wondered if he could refuse. But then he looked around the classroom at the expectant faces, the quiet smirks of the popular kids, and he knew this wasn't about music. It was about making him fail. They were waiting for him to mess up, waiting for him to prove their assumptions about him. They were going to enjoy watching him fail, and Jason could feel it in his gut. With a deep breath, he nodded, though a storm of emotions churned inside him. He knew they thought he wouldn't be good enough. But what they didn't know was that Jason wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Tomorrow, they would see something they didn't expect. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind racing 1,000 miles a minute. Mrs. Monroe's challenge echoed in his head, a constant reminder of the trap she had set. She didn't think he could play. In fact, she probably didn't expect him to even make it through a single piece without stumbling over the keys. The thought of performing in front of the class made his stomach churn, but it wasn't fear that twisted inside him. No, it was something deeper, a quiet determination that grew stronger with each passing hour. Jason didn't say anything to his mom that night, but he knew she could sense the tension in the air. She was quiet as he walked into the living room, where his grandfather's old piano sat, gathering dust in the corner. Jason ran his fingers over the keys, their surface smooth beneath his touch, but it felt so distant, like a different life altogether. The piano had been his grandfather's, a masterful jazz player in his time, a man whose music had filled every room he entered. Jason had always loved playing, but it was a private thing. He hadn't played for anyone in years. But this wasn't just about music. It was about proving something. Not to Mrs. Monroe, not to his classmates, but to himself. He wasn't going to let them define him. They thought they knew what he was capable of, but they had no idea. He had spent hours at this piano, his hands moving over the keys as his grandfather had taught him, feeling the music deep in his bones. Tomorrow, when he walked into that classroom, it wouldn't be about showing off or trying to impress anyone. It would be about standing up for himself, showing them all that they were wrong. And when he played, he would make them listen. Every note would speak louder than any words ever could. The next day, Jason walked into his history class with his head held a little higher than usual. The usual crowd was already settling into their seats, whispering among themselves, waiting for the bell to ring. Jason took a seat near the back of the room, his hands fidgeting nervously with the hem of his shirt. The old piano sat in the corner of the room, an ancient, forgotten instrument that no one ever touched, its keys yellow with age. Jason could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, their quiet anticipation almost suffocating. They were waiting for him to mess up. They thought he'd stumble, that he'd freeze the moment he sat down at the piano. But Jason wasn't nervous about playing. He was nervous about the moment they would realize they were wrong. He could already picture the look on Mrs. Monroe's face, the smug satisfaction that would turn into confusion when he played. His hands were sweating, but not because of fear. No, it was because he knew the stakes. This wasn't just a performance. It was his chance to change the way they saw him. When the bell finally rang, Mrs. Monroe stood up, her usual stern expression settling into place as she addressed the class. "All right, Jason," she said, her voice calm but with that unmistakable edge. "It's your turn." Jason stood, his legs slightly shaky, but his resolve stronger than ever. He made his way to the piano, his heart thumping in his chest like a drumbeat. He could feel the room go still, the tension thick as syrup. With a deep breath, he sat down, his fingers lightly brushing the keys. And then, without hesitation, he began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, like a whisper in the air. But as his fingers danced across the keys, the music grew stronger, more confident. It was a blues melody, rich and soulful, a tune that had been passed down through generations in his family. It was as if his grandfather was sitting beside him, guiding his hands. The class was silent. No one dared to breathe. Jason wasn't just playing. He was telling a story of resilience, of not being defined by the labels they had placed on him. Every note he played shattered the expectations they had, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the music. The sound filled the room, and Jason realized he wasn't just playing for class. He was playing for himself. As Jason's fingers glided effortlessly over keys, something in the room shifted. The music began as a soft, lilting tune, the kind of blues that crept into your soul and made you sway without even realizing it. His fingers moved faster now, the tempo picking up, and the notes seemed to weave a story all on their own. Jason had always felt a deep connection to the piano. It wasn't just about playing. It was about feeling the music, letting it speak when words failed. His grandfather had taught him that music was a language all its own, one that could convey emotion in a way no one else could understand. But as Jason played, he noticed something. The room, once thick with tension, had grown silent. The usual whispers, the side glances, the half-formed snickers, they were all gone. Mrs. Monroe stood frozen, her arms crossed, but there was no smugness in her eyes now. Her expression was hard to read, but Jason could feel the shift. The students who had once been so sure he would fail were now watching him with rapt attention. Their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and, dare he think it, respect. Tyler, who had been Jason's only friend in the class, sat at the edge of his seat, his mouth slightly open in surprise. The other students, once indifferent, once dismissive, now sat forward, their curiosity piqued. The popular kids, the ones who had snickered behind Jason's back, now couldn't take their eyes off him. Jason let the music build, his hands moving faster, pushing the limits of the old piano. Every chord, every run of notes was a declaration, a defiant shout against everything they had assumed about him. He wasn't just a kid in the back of the class, a forgotten face. He was someone with a voice, with a story, and that story was being told through every note that filled the room. The class sat in stunned silence, each person grappling with what they had just witnessed. Jason wasn't sure how long he played, but it didn't matter. The music had said everything they needed to hear. And for the first time, he felt like he had their attention, not because he'd asked for it, but because he'd earned it. As the last note echoed through the room, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Jason's fingers hovered over the keys, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He could feel all eyes on him, but he didn't dare look up. For the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for someone to dismiss him or make him feel invisible. The music had done what he couldn't, proven to everyone in that room, especially to Mrs. Monroe, that he was more than they thought. There was no applause, no overwhelming recognition, just silence, the kind of silence that forces people to reflect, to reassess everything they thought they knew. Mrs. Monroe stood at the front of the room, her arms still crossed, but now her expression was uncertain. Jason could see it in her eyes, the moment when the confidence she'd once had in her assumptions began to crack. She was no longer sure. Not of the answers she thought she knew, not of the story she'd been telling herself. Then, something unexpected happened. Jason heard a soft voice from the back of the room. It was a student, one who had always been quiet, always on the sidelines. "If he'd messed up," she said, almost nervously, "would you have praised him for trying?" The words hung in the air, simple, but they cut to the heart of it all. The room shifted. The class, which had once sat with bated breath waiting for Jason to fail, was now filled with murmurs of agreement, of discomfort. Jason looked up then, meeting Mrs. Monroe's gaze for the first time. She didn't have an answer. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. But it wasn't just to him. It was to them, to the system that had believed he would fail before even giving him a chance. And that was the lesson. People will make assumptions, will decide who you are based on what they think they know. But actions, real, undeniable actions, have a way of cutting through those assumptions. Jason didn't need to prove anything with words. He'd done it with his music. In that moment, he wasn't the quiet kid in the back of the room anymore. He was someone who had shown everyone, including himself, that he was worth seeing. The class slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the tension that had once hung in the air was gone. Mrs. Monroe cleared her throat, tried to regain control of the lesson, but it was obvious the dynamic had changed. Students shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, and Jason noticed for the first time that they were looking at him differently. The sneers, the dismissive glances, the whispers, they had all faded away. Now, there was something else in their eyes, something closer to respect. Tyler, his one real friend in the class, gave him a subtle nod from the corner of the room. It wasn't a huge gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was as if he, too, had just realized something important, that Jason wasn't the quiet, invisible kid he had once been. And that wasn't just about the music. It was about what had happened in that room. Jason hadn't just proven he could play the piano. He had proven he could rise above the labels they had placed on him, the assumptions they had made. He had shown them that their expectations didn't define him. As the class went on, Jason couldn't help but reflect on what had just transpired. Mrs. Monroe had asked him to play because she thought he would fail. She had expected him to embarrass himself, to confirm her belief that he didn't belong in the spotlight. But Jason had done the opposite. He had taken the stage, not with arrogance or defiance, but with confidence. He hadn't played to prove her wrong. He had played because, for the first time, he was playing for himself. That was the lesson Jason would carry with him. It wasn't about trying to change people's minds or forcing them to see him in a different light. It was about knowing his worth, regardless of what others thought. People would always make assumptions about him, but it was up to him to show that those assumptions didn't matter. And from that day forward, Jason knew one thing for certain. He would never let anyone else define him again. He had already shown the world who he was.